they get these messages that they got to be self-reliant. It's either outright told to them or it's implied that they got to be self-reliant.
Yeah.
And they also get messages that are either told to them or hinted at that they can't ask for needs to be met. That they got to bottle things up. It's almost like sometimes they got to take care of their parent instead of being able to just be open and honest about how they feel.
Have you been wondering how to break free from the affair once and for all? Now's the time to take back your life, your emotions, find happiness, joy, and fulfillment with your marriage. HealingBrokenTrust.com is the place where you can find resources to take the healing journey to the next level. You'll find incredible resources for every stage of your affair recovery journey. Connect with our team of qualified affair recovery therapists who stay current with the ever-growing, ever-changing affair recovery research that's available to help you heal wherever you are in the process. Take our home study course focused on helping you communicate and express yourself in a way that gets you what you want. You can also book an incredible one-on-one intensive retreat where instead of dragging out the pain over months or years, you can condense the time it takes to heal in just a matter of days using scientifically proven methods that work to help couples lower their guard, let go of the fear, melt the anger, and experience each other at a deep emotional level you may have never experienced before. So what are you waiting for? Go to HealingBrokenTrust.com. So go to HealingBrokenTrust.com and we'll talk to you soon. Wherever you are, welcome to Healing Broken Trust podcast. We're joining you from our lovely home in the suburbs of Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's a Saturday afternoon during nap time, and so it's just you and us for the next half hour or so. We have an interesting topic that we're talking about today, right, Brad?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating subject. We're talking about what does the childhood look like, the typical childhood look like of your average person who's unfaithful.
Okay.
And so I think this is really fascinating. Of course, I'm a therapist, so I'm fascinated by things like this, but I think our listeners will be fascinated by this too.
Yeah, I think so too.
Because sometimes, people get stuck on the why. I don't understand why they did it. And none of this is excuse making, but if you want to understand the psychology of the one who's unfaithful, the psychology of the betrayer, this is often a good place to start.
Okay.
But it doesn't explain everything. So here's what you cannot do. You cannot say you had a crappy childhood, that's why you cheated on me. Because the one who had the affair often doesn't feel that way. These are things that may influence them, have affected them, but they often won't say it's because blah, blah, blah from my past is why I cheated on you. They're going to be unhappy about the relationship. But as we'll talk about this, we'll see how this influenced them. Whereas someone else who was unhappy or equally unhappy, who didn't experience some of these things, didn't make the same choices.
Okay.
And so this is a thing that kind of influences us in some ways subconsciously, impacts us. And so this isn't, excuse making, justifications, anything like that. But it is a way to kind of understand, where did they come from? What kind of past did they have? What's the average past look like? And I'm in a unique situation where I get to meet people every day who've experienced infidelity, who've betrayed their spouse. So I'm one of the few people on the planet who kind of knows what kind of past they have and what kind of background they have. And so
you've seen so much.
Yeah. And it's a lot of fun because your past isn't your destiny, but if we don't really work on it and heal wounds, we may end up hurting other people.
Gotcha.
And so that's kind of what we're talking about.
That's really interesting. So speaking of one of the things that you had actually brought up, why do some people cheat, or why are some people unfaithful and others are not when they have similar pasts that are, bad?
Yeah, I think part of that really depends on the type of emotional or relational resiliency they develop. A lot of folks will, I would say most, at least, I don't know if this is accurate, but I think a lot of people have a very unhappy childhood, but they don't always make terrible life choices. Some people have a good childhood and they make terrible life choices. So it's not always predictive, but what really helps people is the amount of emotional support they had. It doesn't matter that you went through terrible things as a child. You immigrated from a different country, you're a refugee, or you were a victim of violence as a child, or a parent died as a child. Those things don't have to predict, later behavior, but oftentimes they can. But the real factor is, did you have somebody there for you emotionally? And so those things aren't always causes.
Okay.
To like being unfaithful. What the real factor is did they have emotional support? Did they have people that they could lean on emotionally? Did they have warm parents? Did they have both parents who were warm? It's just not just enough to really have one. Not with the way, parenting works. You need to really have both warm parents and both parents involved and both parents be attentive. You may have been able to get away with dad being out of the home a lot, 50 years ago because you had grandparents who were more involved throughout the whole, upbringing of the children. And today, parents are usually kind of relying on themselves. You don't always have, close family units. Mm-hmm. And so,
absolutely.
So anyway, the big thing is really resiliency. If you've got emotional support and you've got people there for you in tough times as a child, you're going to probably do better, relationally. Because here's the thing, Morgan, like you can even have siblings in the same family. Just as an example, like, the dad is abusive or they experience really deep traumatizing things. But if, say, the mom kind of comforts the younger sibling because the child's the baby, mom gives it more attention and consideration. And the baby could be like 10 years old. And then the other child's, like 13. That 13-year-old maybe looks a little bit more independent. And the child's going through the same stressful thing as the 10-year-old's going through. But they're getting more attention, more warmth. They're learning that they're still valuable, that they're still loved. The 13-year-old who wants to be independent on their own, they're still going through hell, but they're not getting the same message. And so they're not developing that same sense of resiliency. And I would say that's really the hidden thing that's there.
Okay, so can you paint a picture of the childhood of a typical betrayer or someone who is unfaithful? Yes. What does it look like?
Well, I would say the typical childhood boils down to really one thing, or maybe a couple things. The theme is a childhood with kind of cold, emotionally detached parents. Inattentive parents, parents who are not just inattentive, but maybe even rejecting. They're distant themselves. They're preoccupied with their own issues and problems. They love their kids just as much as I love our son. I'd give anything in the world for our son. They would give anything in the world for their children. But they don't really know how to connect emotionally themselves. And so you can't give a child something that you don't have yourself. Sometimes there's this void, lack of emotional connection, this distance. So the child never, what this creates, and this is really the important thing, is it creates somebody who is out of touch with their own emotions and feelings. And they feel uncomfortable feeling vulnerable. They feel weak being vulnerable. And so they don't ever want to share that part of themselves with anybody. And they don't share it with their spouse because they don't want to share it with anybody. They definitely don't want to. They love their spouse more than anything. And they really cherish their spouse. And I think this is true for almost everybody who cheats. I think there's very few people who really don't care for their spouse at all. But I think I would bet money that almost everybody who has an affair really genuinely cares about their spouse. But here's the thing I want to get to is they feel very uncomfortable being vulnerable and expressing emotions and vulnerability and needs. And so when they get unhappy in a relationship, they don't go to their spouse and say, I'm really unhappy. This is really unfair, because they hate conflict. So what they do is, and this is all stuff they learned in childhood, so what they do is they just bury it. They keep it to themselves. What ends up happening is they resent the heck out of their spouse. And that's the justification for being unfaithful later.
And something
They never speak up, though. They never say, hey, this bothers me.
Now, their parents would be maybe cold or distant or inattentive, but I imagine since their parents really do love them, I mean, that can't be 100% of the time that they're inattentive or distant. It might be an inattentiveness or distance surrounding certain things in life or moments in life when they needed their mom or dad, but their parent wasn't able to respond, and maybe and I'd like to ask you, is that true? Would that be something that you could say, that maybe their parent wasn't 100% terrible or distant all the time? Maybe their parent just wasn't able to respond when they needed something, or in a moment of crisis, or does it need to be all the time?
I think that's a great question. I think the biggest wounds people develop are wounds of abandonment and betrayal by close loved ones. If I get betrayed by somebody that I'm not emotionally close to, that hurts, and I might hold resentment towards them. But if you get betrayed by somebody who's your emotional world, that will keep you up at night. That will make you obsessed. That, like, it won't just put a chip on your shoulder. Like if it's a colleague who hurts you, that'll bother you. And it may even bother you for a while. But if it's your own safe haven, the person who's supposed to be there for you, if they betray you, and honestly, if you've never had anybody there before, a parent, a grandparent, mom, dad, any siblings, if you've never had anybody there for you emotionally, and then you get betrayed, it's a lot harder thing to ever trust another person with again. And so here's kind of the thought process, and I want to answer your question and help me make sure I'm answering it. But I want to,
okay.
This is something I kind of jotted down. This is how the person who has an affair thinks. And this is typical, because usually the one who has an affair is the one in the relationship who's more the avoider. They're the one who shares the least emotionally. They're the one who tends to be more independent. They're kind of the fixer in the relationship. Women, can fit that mold. You see a lot of guys with that. Usually a pursuer in the relationship will have an affair when they've been trying for a long time and they feel like they're not getting through to their spouse. And they'll have an affair when they start giving up on their relationship. And their affair is sometimes more about wanting to be attractive and, and pretty, and somebody's interested in me. Sometimes it's more about that. And an avoider will have an affair because for different reasons, they just don't really trust anybody. And they may not say that. An avoider can be somebody who's really happy, cheerful, outgoing, but what they're avoiding is their own emotions, because they're uncomfortable. It's a foreign territory for them. They don't know how to navigate it. And so an avoider would say, this is what they would say. They would say, I am somewhat uncomfortable being close to others. I find it difficult to trust them completely. It's difficult to allow myself to depend on them. I am nervous when anyone gets too close, and often others want me to be more intimate than I feel comfortable being. So I'll read that again. An avoider would say, I am somewhat uncomfortable being close to others. I find it difficult to trust them completely. It's difficult to allow myself to depend on them. I am nervous when anyone gets too close, and often others want me to be more intimate than I feel comfortable being. And so I don't really trust you, but at the same time, I'm nervous about you getting too close to me. So they're kind of an island. They really thrive on feeling independent and not needing other people too much, but they do need other people. So what they do is they kind of start turning off emotions and feelings and withdrawing. They shut down when there's an argument. They get quiet. They hold back. They don't like conflict at all. And so they'll hold back these things. And so what happens is over time, they build a lot of resentment. Really what they're scared of is giving themselves completely over to another person and fully trusting another person. So they sometimes can have like a really low commitment to a relationship. But the irony is they're not really giving anything extra or special in the affair than what they've already given in their marriage. So even though sometimes spouses read, text messages or love letters or whatever, and they'll read this and they're like, oh my gosh, he's given this woman all these things that he's never given me, or he hasn't given that to me in a while. I would venture to say he's not giving her anything. He's not giving anything that he's never given before. Like he doesn't know how to be truly vulnerable and truly let someone in because of some of these things that we need to get into.
So he's not necessarily giving more to that relationship than he's given to yours because he doesn't know how.
Yeah. Now he may be giving more
verbally.
Well, in this time period.
Okay.
Like he's having an affair.
Right.
Obviously, he's giving more to that relationship than the marriage.
Right, because he's invested in that more than he's invested in the marriage.
Yeah.
So he might be having sex or something with this other person, but he doesn't necessarily let them into his vulnerable, dark places.
No. And it may feel that way because there's love letters, flowers, pictures, sexting, different things like that. But no, they're not giving anything emotionally of themselves more. Like they don't suddenly become a different person. And now I'm going to be vulnerable with you. They don't. Typically, that's not what happens. So what does the typical childhood look like of someone who has an affair? What you typically see, Morgan, is you see parents who are consistently cool, who are consistently inattentive.
Oh, so there's consistency to the parents' behavior. So it has to be something projected over time.
I think it could be both. Like back to your question, like is it big events that do it, or is it, kind of? I think it's a pattern of behavior that's modeled that they see. But at the same time, if the event is big enough, they can lose their trust, and just decide I need to learn and lean on myself.
Especially if the event doesn't ever find resolve, if they don't find resolve after that, or healing, or they don't fix the relationship after the big event.
Yeah, you got to mend it. You got to be able to restore it. Got to work through it. I would say the thing is probably the biggest is, there's events, but what really does it is, I think sometimes it's a combination of both, to be honest with you. Yeah, it's a consistency, like inattentive, consistently cool, consistently rejecting, even sometimes just being angry. Having your parent always angry with you, snapping at you. Like you learn not to open up. You learn not to open up when they're rejecting, when they're inattentive.
Yeah.
When they're just kind of whatever, cool. And so what you need, or what happens is you see this pattern of behavior from the parent's side of just being kind of detached and not really caring about their child emotionally. But you often see, because of that, these events that happen where they may be the ones hurting the child in abusive ways or exposing them to risk and harm. So it's more of this parenting style than that produces these other things that create
this elusive, cool person who's maybe detached emotionally that then turns into someone who betrays their partner because they don't know how to connect emotionally.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's the other things that kind of go into a child having this, who later becomes like a potential future cheater. One of them is from the parent, they will send messages to the child that they will be punished if they try to seek closeness from the child. And so one of the things that can happen is Morgan and I think we might have talked about this on the podcast, but this just and I hear about stuff all the time in my office, but this is kind of one I saw firsthand. Our son, we had to take him to the doctor, and while we were in the waiting room, there was a little 5-year-old girl. It's a big waiting room. The parents were on different sides of the waiting room. Little 5-year-old girl looking at fish in the fish tank, and I didn't see it happen, but she fell on the ground, tripped and fell. She's of course crying, and both of her parents were immediately
they didn't do anything.
Well, they didn't do anything, number one. But do you remember
I do.
Both of them were saying I think it was more the dad. The mom kind of agreed with the dad. Unless your arm is cut off.
Or you're bleeding to death.
Yeah, unless your arm's cut off or you're bleeding to death, quit your crying.
Yeah, don't cry.
Don't cry. What that signals to a child is, but here's the thing, it's not, nobody thinks back to that and says, when I was 5, I couldn't be open. But what they learn is subconsciously, over time, they develop a mental model that becomes their blueprint for future relationships, that they can't go to somebody for support.
Yeah, so can't go to their parent, that attachment figure.
Yeah, they can't go to their parent. I'm going to get punished. So what happens when they enter into a relationship is, I can't go to my girlfriend or my boyfriend. I'll get punished for it. And so what they do is they
hide.
They hold it in, and then they resent their spouse or their girlfriend or boyfriend because they're not sharing what they're really feeling and needing. And they magically assume you should know. And they're resenting the crap out of them. And then they are really unhappy in the relationship. And because they don't really know how to ever give themselves to someone completely, they kind of get into these affairs. They can kind of either flirt with someone else, or they're really susceptible to someone flirting with them. Or when the opportunity arises because of travel or other things, they're kind of susceptible to it. Nobody's ever going to say when they cheated, it was because of this in the doctor's office when I was 5.
Right.
The girl's not going to remember that because there's going to be a crap load of other examples that she'll have. Right. But it's the pattern that develops.
That consistent message.
And what develops is this mental model. This is how relationships work. At that young of an age, when that model gets developed, you have no idea, if this is healthy or unhealthy or not. You just know this is how relationships work because that's what you see in your family. You're 5 years old. You may just be beginning to start kindergarten. You may not even be in kindergarten yet. There's a whole lot of crap that's happened yet. And you're not even able to logically say, this is dysfunctional. You can't even say that. But what's crazy about that is the parents who are like 20, 25 years older than their daughter are sending those kind of messages to her. Mm-hmm. And I think, and I know they love their child just as much as we love our son. But, that child doesn't get that impression. Right. They don't feel lovable. And they can't show that vulnerability because there's a mental model that gets developed. And so what they do is they turn off emotions because they feel weak and inadequate. And what they're really getting away from when they withdraw and shut down and are quiet and aren't vulnerable is they're really getting away from those feelings of feeling inadequate. That's what's really going on. Mm-hmm. It's not about always getting away from their spouse. Sometimes they don't want to create conflict, but they're really trying to get away from, I feel inadequate and I don't want to express that kind of vulnerability because I'll feel weak. And if you think I'm weak and not strong, you won't like me very much.
Yeah, so I'm not going to be those feelings of, and those feelings of weakness are going to be validated. Those feelings of inadequacy are basically validated by the partner. Mm-hmm. So they just don't want to go there.
Well, and they value peace because they feel closest to their partner, their spouse, when there's no conflict. Mm-hmm. And obviously you have to deal with crap in a marriage to really have a good marriage. You can't just brush stuff under the rug. You got to be open and honest.
And that's also why it's really important that if your partner does come to you with something that's vulnerable or that gives you a glimpse of what's really happening inside their mind and their heart, to not swipe at them and get upset with them because it sort of validates that fear of they're not going to accept me. I'm not going to be okay. And so I think being able to look out for those things as they come, if they are vulnerable with you, to be able to see it as it comes your way, I think is really valuable. And I think that's just a tremendous thing. Mm-hmm. That, I mean, I know you teach people how to do that in the retreats and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So
because this is not set in stone. You really need therapy help because this can change. Mm-hmm. And hopefully listening to this is helpful, but this isn't like set in stone. Like people can change out of this.
Right. Yeah. So that's a good question that you're leading into, I think. Mm-hmm. If they've had this childhood and they've responded the way they have, and it's led them down the path of infidelity, we get into this once a cheater, always a cheater. Is that really possible? I mean, can they get out of that? Can they change? Can they be different? Can they, if they identify, these patterns in their life and everything, can they change? Can they become no longer someone down that path, I guess?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they can change. I think the best way to change, though, is couples therapy. You have to have that, because you have to feel like you can let them in. Mm-hmm. Into your secrets, into your vulnerability, into the deepest and darkest, scariest place emotionally. You have to be able to let them in, and you have to feel like you can trust them for you not to cheat on them.
And you know what I think is so interesting? Some of these... okay.
Because if you don't do that, you're always going to be prone to having another affair. Now, your spouse, after you cheat on them, you may eventually earn their trust, work your butt off, you do all these things, they finally trust you. But for you to never stray again, you have got to know that you can trust them emotionally and lean on them emotionally. And you got to feel like there's nothing holding you back. You got to feel like, yes, I can give myself completely to you. There's nothing holding me back. And you got to feel like you can share anything with them. If you feel like there's things that you cannot share, people are going to get in trouble there.
Because then you're starting to keep those secrets. The secrets kind of start seeping in again, and then that vulnerability or that resentment can seep in again.
I want to finish this line of thought on kind of the parenting that they experience. So the first one is parents are consistently inattentive, consistently cool, rejecting, or angry in their responses to the young children. Children are kind of met with threats of punishment for trying to get close to their parents, like that little girl in the doctor's waiting room.
Or they say, grow up, you need to stop crying. But crying for a little kid is their language. They don't have English skills. They don't know how to speak like an adult.
You bring up a good point when earlier we were talking about resiliency. You develop resiliency because you feel like you got somebody who has your back. The people who are probably the weakest with the least amount of resiliency are the people who have this relationship style that we're talking about, because they don't ever know how to trust anybody else or fall back on someone else. People like this can be, maybe great soldiers, go to Antarctica, be the solo man who goes to Mars on a one-person mission to Mars because they've turned off their relationship, needs and ability to...
That part of their brain.
Yeah, they turn that off. But when their spouse dies, or when somebody dies, or when they're really in a crisis, they break down. They suffer the worst. They never really truly recover, because when the real issue is they don't let anybody in. They think the real issue is I'm just depressed, or work sucks, or this or this or this or that.
Which could be true, but the real issue.
Those things are important. But the real issue is they don't know how to really let anybody in. Their defenses, they turn off their emotions. And so, Morgan, the third thing is, and this is kind of something we hinted at, there's violent or abusive behavior on the part of an attachment figure. And an attachment figure is somebody that you trust, that you feel like you can go to in times of difficulty, like a parent, grandparent, older sibling, maybe even a younger sibling, close friend of the family, but you get abused by that person. And so what that tells you as a kid is, man, I cannot be open. I can't even go to my own dad. He's an alcoholic and he's beating the crap out of mom. He's threatened to beat me. He gets in my face. He's hit me, where I've had marks and I couldn't go to school. If I can't trust dad, who can I trust? And so,
what does that say about me as a person?
Yeah, what does it say about me if my own dad doesn't like me and he's beating the crap out of me?
Yeah.
That says a lot, and so that creates somebody who's got this kind of relationship style of being able to really be where they feel really uncomfortable being close to others. They find it difficult to trust them completely. It's difficult to allow themselves to depend on someone else, and they're nervous about someone getting too close. And they find that they're in relationships where the other partner always wants them to be more open, reveal more. And then the last thing, and this is something you hinted at, they have parents who either outright say or hint at that they need to be more self-reliant, more independent.
That's right.
You got to be tougher. You got to stand on your own feet. And there's don't get me wrong, you got to do that age appropriately. But if you're doing that, when it's an inappropriate age level, if your high school student loses his girlfriend and he's sad about that, you can't just tell him like, sorry bud, move on. You're going to meet a girl in college. You can do that later, but you can't do that
in the moment when he's hurting.
Yeah, you got to just comfort him and try to be there and listen. Eventually you can say, I went through the same thing, and that's when I met your mother, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I know right now it doesn't feel that way, but I'm always here, and if I can talk with you about it, I'm here.
Yeah, instead of the opposite, where it's like, grow a pair, stop crying, suck it up, be a man. Yeah. Like that doesn't work. It doesn't draw them closer. It doesn't teach them how to manage their feelings or their emotions or their needs, or their, they just shut down and pull away from you, and that's how they respond to their spouse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. The other thing is, they get these messages that they got to be self-reliant. It's either outright told to them or it's implied that they got to be self-reliant. Yeah. And they also get messages that are either told to them or hinted at that they can't ask for needs to be met. That they got to bottle things up. It's almost like sometimes they got to take care of their parent instead of being able to just be open and honest about how they feel. One of the things that's dangerous about this, Morgan, is, and this is not meant to make anybody feel terrible, but unless we kind of think about these things and work on these things on ourselves, because we have that mental model, we can do it to our own kids. Mm-hmm. So we have to kind of be aware of this and think about this. And we have to really be able to provide for our own kids secure attachment.
Right.
And in relationships, we always ask, are you there for me? And if we feel like our caregiver is there for us, we feel worthy of love, and we'll have a secure relationship style where we feel like we can be open and honest and totally give ourselves to somebody.
Yeah, and I think as I listen to you say this, it really brings to mind kids of parents who were alcoholics, who maybe were a sexual abuse survivor, incest survivor, and whenever it's not always, like I say, it's not always physical bruises, but they're emotional bruises, that there's psychological bruising that happens, and if you don't deal with it, if you don't handle it, if you don't heal from it, and you can't really do it alone. It's not anything you can do alone, and it's typically much better when you can heal with the one that's your spouse, the one that's you're
a heck of a lot better.
Yeah.
Here's the thing, Morgan. It's your spouse who's validating you and confirming you. It's a deeper level of change than individual therapy.
Than just individual therapy. Yeah.
It's your spouse validating you, not a stranger who's nice. It's your own spouse.
Right.
And
that attachment figure, that person in your life that's supposed to love you unconditionally, like your parent was supposed to love you unconditionally. And so I understand this at a personal level, just how difficult it can be to have to, be the caregiver to the parent. And so if that's you, I know I haven't been an unfaithful person, so you can totally not come away as an unfaithful person and that sort of thing, but it does impact and affect your relationships with other people, and the most important relationship with your spouse. It does impact that. So it's really important to get the help to heal this, is really what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, you gotta, yes, of course, because Morgan, to answer your question, once a cheater, always a cheater.
Right.
I think you're prone to do it again if you don't get the help. This is not something, it's not even that you have to come to us. We're available. We have retreats. We work. We love to help. It's what we do. We love it. But you've got to get the help, because if you don't, and you can't let somebody in, you're prone to repeat the past. And even when you hate it, people hate doing this crap, but they still find themselves drugged to it because they're not really working with somebody who knows how to help them.
Right.
It's like trying to lose weight. It's like you see somebody who's obese, who's really overweight. They've done everything they can. They yo-yo diet. They're trying to break it. But sometimes you got to go get outside help. Some things are just bigger than us, and we got to go get help. There's no shame in that.
No. Nobody
would say to somebody who's overweight that's been yo-yo dieting for years, like, there's any shame in going to get help with that.
No.
You would encourage them to do it.
Right.
So if you're listening to us and you are yo-yoing, in your own version of a yo-yo diet in your relationship and trying to be faithful and trying to heal from an affair, don't do it. Nobody thinks you're crazy if you go get help. It's not a sign of weakness. You don't think that about anybody who's that way with their weight. Why think that about yourself? Don't be naive. Don't be dumb about that. The other thing, Morgan, I want to give a couple examples.
Oh, yes. Yeah, please.
Of kind of childhoods. The big thing here is they are emotionally just, like I said, those four things, that's the common thing. And you just need one of those to really kind of develop into like an avoidant relationship style. Okay. Here's an example of some of these things that we're talking about. One of them is like a parent teaching a child to lie. We don't tell mom about this. Keep this a secret for me. I'm going to tell you what it is, but keep this a secret from mom. What does that child learn about relationships? That it's okay to have secrets. It's okay to not fully give yourself over to someone. So, it's foolish to trust somebody. Hide things to keep the peace. And so that child learns that, and people don't really question things that they learn from their parents. They just kind of automatically, they hear it and then they act it out. They live it out. They don't question it. You eat it. You don't contemplate it. So anyway,
they're kids.
Yeah, they're kids, and it's where you start learning these relationships. So anyway, the second thing is, I had a client once whose mom I asked him what his happiest childhood memory was, and he said Christmas, because that's the time of year. He said the holidays, actually, because that's the time of year that I knew my mom loved me. That's the only time she ever said she loved me. And so this particular person would, never really had just one best friend. He had like a gazillion friends, but he never really let anybody in on his emotional world because he couldn't do it with mom. And then it played out into his relationship where he could never really give himself to his wife.
So they were just very shallow relationships.
Yeah. An abusive dad. One that's physically abusive, that hurts mom. That's abusive towards the child. That's an alcoholic. You just learn you can't trust. And there's kind of the common theme. You're not there for me. I can't trust you. I can't get my needs met through you. I've got to shut down because this is scary. We develop that template, and then we use that, even though our spouse isn't that way. Maybe they are, but most likely they're probably not that way. We still kind of act like they are. We still hide and withdraw and don't fully give ourselves, because our first examples were of never giving ourselves completely. And so what happens is when our spouse starts wanting us to be more open with them, it feels very foreign to us. It feels very uncomfortable, extremely uncomfortable. And most people can't do it on their own. And so it's kind of what we talked about, therapy, going to therapy. Having a parent who's not an attachment figure, but like a grandparent. It's like, you got to go to a grandparent to get your needs met. You can't even go to your own parent. Your parents are so messed up, you can't even go to them, but you got to go to a grandparent,
Or a teacher.
Yeah, or a teacher, or someone else, a coach. Somebody who's been, sexually abused. The general theme is cut off parents, who aren't there. And they, we're going to hear from all the time people who say, because here's the golden question. I hear people all the time who say, "Oh, I had a great childhood," and I'll follow up with the golden question, well, who did you go to when you were hurt, sad, or afraid? When you were lonely as a kid? Well, nobody, or if they say they could, who did you go to when you were, so you could go to somebody, who was it? Oh, it was probably mom. It was probably mom that I could go to. Well, can you give me any examples of when you did that? No, come to think of it, I can't. Well, maybe I did. Could I go to mom? I don't remember ever going to her, actually. Or it never occurred to me that I could. Those are all things that are examples of this avoidant attachment style. And many people who end up becoming unfaithful, that's kind of the childhood that they had. And so hopefully this has been beneficial for you guys, and we don't want to lead you into any confusion or anything. So hopefully this has been beneficial. This is not destiny. This doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to, because it's your childhood or your spouse's childhood, doesn't mean it's predictive of future results in the future, but you do have to go to work on it, because most likely it can be. Maybe it will be. So you got to go to work on it. Here's kind of just some other childhoods that, let me move my papers around so I can share this. Kind of other examples of childhoods. The kind of childhood that we want is, we want to be able to say, we had a secure childhood that produces where we feel like our caregiver is there for us, and we feel worthy of love because our caregiver was attentive, they were responsive to us, and they were engaged with us. And so somebody who has a secure style would say, I find it relatively easy to get close to others, and I'm comfortable depending on them and having them depend on me. I don't worry about being abandoned or about someone getting too close. I'm very comfortable in this relationship. And so people who are securely attached, who are married to each other, are going to be the ones who have the best relationships, because they both feel comfortable being vulnerable and open. But now this is earlier when I was talking about a pursuer, who gets burned out and then they have an affair. This is typically what they're going to say. They're going to say, this is what an anxious partner would say, a pursuer. They're going to say, I find that others are reluctant to get as close as I would like. I often worry that my partner doesn't really love me or won't want to stay with me. I want to get very close to my partner, and this sometimes scares people away. So an anxious is going to say, I find that others are reluctant to get as close as I would like. I often worry that my partner doesn't really love me or won't want to stay with me. So they're really anxious about the state of their relationship. I want to get very close to my partner, and this sometimes scares people away. And so those folks will have an affair when they start feeling like, I'm not going to get my needs met in this relationship. Kind of like we talked about last time in Hell or High Water, despair and detachment, that they will begin to grieve that they're not going to get their relationship needs met, and then they're vulnerable to an affair happening.
Yeah, so definitely check out that episode. It's called Hell or High Water, Despair and Detachment, because it's really helpful to kind of understand what happens whenever you start to burn out of the relationship and where it goes from there.
Yeah. Morgan, that's kind of it for right now. Any questions? Anything else we need to kind of look over?
Well, I think that you've really described avoidant attachment pretty well. Can you kind of sum it up in more of a definitive way? What in like a couple of words does avoidant attachment mean?
Avoidant attachment in a few words means I don't trust you and I'm uncomfortable getting close to you.
Okay, so an avoidant attachment person, if they don't feel like they can...
I don't feel like I can give all of myself to you because I don't trust you, and you may be perfect, but if I'm afraid you'll see me as weak, and that causes me to hold back.
And that holding back causes the negative cycle to spiral, and it can open up vulnerabilities for them to cheat, to have an affair. Okay, and ultimately what we're saying is that their childhood is a big indicator of...
This is where the childhood is where the avoidant attachment's created.
Yeah.
You don't go from a secure attachment style all throughout childhood, and then you leave home and you're an adult, and then develop an avoidant attachment style. Like that typically doesn't happen. You've got to develop a lot of crap's got to happen for that to develop. But an avoidant attachment style, in just a few words, is I don't really trust you with myself, giving you all of myself and my emotions. I prefer my independence, and that's because of the way they were raised. They couldn't really trust their parents.
Okay, and then ultimately it boils down to if you can get help and you work on these things, you don't have to go down that path. It doesn't necessarily have to be the end for you. You don't have to experience infidelity in your relationship if you can identify what's really happening emotionally and take the necessary actions. I think that's great. Thank you very much, Brad, for explaining this to us. And I think that's the show.
Yeah. Thank you guys for listening.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Healing Broken Trust podcast. Are you ready to take the next step? Go to healingbrokentrust.com and schedule your one-on-one coaching call today. That's healingbrokentrust.com.